I want to walk back to 2011. It was a dark, cold night in 2011, and it was the first time I visited China. And the plane that I was flying on from Hong Kong landed in Beijing. And the flight attendants opened the door, and suddenly we were accosted by this smell. It smelled like we were in a forest fire. It honestly smelled like we were in a forest fire. And I got out of the plane and walked through the airport, and it's a beautiful, if you've not been to the Beijing airport, a beautiful new airport designed by Norman Foster. And it's a marvelous, massive steel and glass structure. And I walked to baggage claim to get my bag, and I realized as I was looking in this cavernous room that I could literally see particles in the air. So I asked on this trip to Beijing over the next week or so what was happening, and what I was told was that was coal. It was coal in two ways. First of all, it was coal being burned in power plants. But second of all, and probably at least certainly to me even more surprisingly, it was coal being burned in houses for heat. It was like something out of Dickens's London. And yet this is happening in massive proportions in China today. So that was my introduction to China. A couple of trips ago, I was in China most recently about 3 or 4 weeks ago, but last fall in November, I had another trip to China. And I landed, and it turned out that the skies were beautiful. They were blue. And a couple of days later, they were suddenly really, really dark and gray again. And they were so gray, in fact, that when I went to visit someone at an American environmental organization that has an office in Beijing, he gave me a mask. And I'd never worn a mask before in Beijing. If anyone has been to China, particularly the large cities, Beijing, and to a lesser extent Shanghai, you see people walking with masks on the street. And it sort of struck me as borderline offensive, particularly for an American, and I also sort of couldn't understand that a week in China could do that much bad to me. But I wore the mask, and it was extraordinary. And then I took off the mask after about an hour. And you've heard of the frog in the boiling water, where you put the frog in cool water and slowly raise the temperature, and the frog's not aware that he's about to die. But then you drop the frog in boiling water, and he senses what he's facing. It was sort of like that for me. When I was walking around Beijing with no mask on my face, I didn't really have an understanding, although stupidly, when I went for a long run one morning around Tiananmen Square, I kind of felt it. But normally I didn't feel it. And then when I put the mask on, and then I took the mask off, you can bet I felt it. I got a real sense of what I had been breathing in. And you can walk around Beijing and China and see people wearing masks of all designs. You see people wearing polka dot masks. You see people wearing striped masks. You see people wearing Snoopy masks. The mask I was given was a very kind of sophisticated number designed by a clothing company whose t-shirts sell for $30 a piece, and whose t-shirts my brother, who has spent a decent bit of time in China too, used to bring home for my kids. So it says something about a society when face masks become fashion symbols. Now, why am I telling you about, as it were, brown China, when the title of this talk is, as it were, green China? Because I think if you look back in history, plenty of places have made major energy shifts, energy and environmental shifts. But they've made those shifts almost exclusively when they were confronted with what they regarded as a crisis. Something that was palpable, something that was widely felt, something that was almost not debatable. So let me give you a couple of examples. France in the early 1970s was faced with the oil embargo. And at the time, France, like many other countries, produced most of its electricity from oil. And the oil embargo occurred, and there was a real fear in France that the lights were going to go out. There was a public service announcement that was on TV, and French people of a certain age will remember it. And if you speak French, the saying was, "On n'a pas de pétrole, mais on a des idées." And in English, that means, we don't have oil, but we have ideas. And what did France do? Anyone know what France did? Nuclear. France embarked on a massive construction campaign of nuclear power. Now, that was extraordinarily controversial at the time. De Gaulle, who was in charge of France at the time, angered a lot of people with the nuclear construction campaign. But whether you like it or not, at least France's nuclear push had the benefit of intellectual honesty. France decided that it had to do something, and it did something. So let's go across the ocean and across the continent to Los Angeles at about the same time in the 1970s. I suspect many of you spent some time in Los Angeles in the 1970s, and you remember that if you looked at the air in Los Angeles in the 1970s, it wasn't a lot different from pictures that you see of the air in Beijing today. That's not the case in LA anymore. Why? My sense is the reason why is that people looked at little Johnny coughing and getting asthma and decided that that was simply not befitting an industrialized society. That was not acceptable. And so the United States did something about it. There were a series of policies that were enacted. And today, LA's air is a lot cleaner than it was before. So why am I talking about France and Los Angeles in a talk about China? Because I think the United States today does not feel a sense of crisis about energy. We've largely fixed our clean air problem in the United States. Our population and therefore our energy demand is not growing very much domestically. And we are suddenly swimming in domestic fossil fuel, domestic oil and gas. So to the extent that one would have argued 5 or 10 years ago that we had an energy security problem in the United States, it's extraordinarily difficult to make that argument today. Now, let's go back across the Pacific Ocean to China. China feels a sense of crisis. China feels a sense of crisis because of the air. China feels a sense of crisis because of population and economic growth. China feels a sense of crisis because it has a voracious energy demand. And no one needs to tell the people who are making the decisions in Beijing that they need to clean up their act, I mean environmentally. And I'm not suggesting that China is doing this sort of for the good of the glaciers. China is doing this because the environmental problems have become so bad that they've become a palpable threat to the power structure in Beijing. And as a result, and as we will discuss over the next half hour or so, China is taking serious steps to deal with this. So that brings me to the point of what I wanted to say today, which is that China is pursuing the biggest and the most important push for cleaner energy that the world has ever seen. It's not clear that that push is going to succeed. It's not clear that China is going to meet the domestic goals that it's laid out for itself, and I'll go through those in a moment. And maybe even more importantly for us in this room, sitting here in Aspen with gorgeous blue skies, it's not clear that even if China does meet its goals, that is going to address the questions about climate change that scientists have told us are so urgent. What is clear is the following. If China doesn't meet its goals, if China doesn't significantly reduce its carbon emissions, then basically nothing else the world does in that realm will matter. In essence, China's energy push, China's clean energy push, is necessary but not sufficient. Which is why I think if you're interested in the issue of climate change, and I'm going to postulate also that if you're interested in economic risk and economic opportunity, if you want to understand what's going on with China's clean energy bid, its motives, its messiness, and its economics effect, if you want to understand the effect of all of this on the world, you need to understand what's going on in China. So I think it's sort of helpful when I sit in your shoes to understand a little bit about who's yakking at me. Let me just take a second and tell you who I am. I am not a scientist. I'm not an environmental partisan. I'm not a trained China expert. I majored in history in college and never went to graduate school. So if you want to leave now, you may. I'm just a guy who's curious. I'm a guy who distrusts ideology and pat assumptions, and who has a lot of fun telling stories about complex subjects that I hope bring that complexity to life, often by explaining in clear terms the experiences of the people who are involved. In other words, I'm less interested in proposing answers than I am in clarifying messy tensions and questions. The energy and the environment are incredibly, wonderfully complicated issues. To me, at least, they're endlessly fascinating. Part of the reason I find them so fascinating is that they're so often caricatured by political ideologues on both sides, and therefore they're misunderstood by a lot of people. I've been writing about energy and the environment for about 15 years, for much of that time at the Wall Street Journal, based in Detroit, then based in Dallas, and doing a decent bit of international and domestic traveling, and then more recently at Stanford, where I've been doing some academic writing and then also writing for magazines. I didn't set out to spend the better part of my life writing about energy and the environment. I was just kind of a guy who was bitten by the journalistic bug. But I was lucky enough early on to bite into this fascinating, meaty issue And it occurred to me that this was endlessly fascinating, that peeling this onion was going to get even more interesting, and that this had cosmic implications, really important global implications. This was one of those issues of a lifetime. And so I've kind of ridden it. And every day, as I write more about it, I find it more endlessly fascinating. So for a lot of years, I actually had never been to China. And then I got to Stanford, and over the past 3 years or so, I've been to China 7 or 8 times, largely talking to people, researching, reporting, writing about this stuff. And I will tell you, it's a fast-changing story, really, really interesting, constantly surprising, and the stakes are rising. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let me tell you what I want to do over the next 30 minutes or so, and then we will have plenty of time for questions. So I hope that what I say angers you or confuses you or perplexes you, and we'll have a discussion. I want to frame China's clean energy bid. I want to show you some slides about essentially China's energy situation, both the brown side and the green side, to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. And then I want to talk about some of the tensions and the uncertainties that China's clean energy push is creating, particularly geopolitical and economic tensions. Because what I want you to realize is that even though this is a talk titled China's Clean Energy Bid, this is not fundamentally about the environment. This is sort of indirectly about the environment. This is fundamentally about geopolitics and economics. And what happens to the environment, I pretty firmly believe, is going to be a result of what happens politically and economically, or what doesn't happen. So we'll do that. I'm also going to, at the end, take a bit of a deep dive into one of the kind of veins that I think is most interesting in China's clean energy bid, and that is China's solar energy bid, which I think is a fascinating tale and kind of illustrative of what else is going on in China. And then I will be quiet, and we will take questions and have a conversation. So how does that sound? Good? Excellent. Okay. So who's been to China? Who's been to China in the last 5 years? So I suspect that each of you has your own version of the anecdotes I described at the start of this talk. You've breathed that air. I suspect fewer of you have seen some of the following anecdotes. The Beijing skyscraper, in which a guy in his early 40s who's American, who was trained in Florida, has occupied basically an entire floor with Chinese engineers, most of them in their mid-20s, who are designing parts for coal-fired power plants to make coal-fired power plants run more efficiently. He's doing a bang-up business selling those parts to the Chinese utility industry, which is building power plants at a feverish pace. And believe it or not, he's actually now starting to export those parts back to the United States, which, although it's not building a lot more clean-fired power plants, is reaching the point where it has to retrofit power plants that have come to sort of the end of their life. So there's the government building on the west side of Beijing, where government planners are sitting there designing clean energy goals for the country, low carbon targets. And these are employees of the Chinese Communist state, and they are promulgating clean energy policies, some of which you've read about over the past week, and they are engaging in fights with their bosses to try to make those policies tougher. And it's interesting when you hear them talk about it, as I did over dumplings in the Beijing train station in the last few months, because the fights that they have with their bosses are extraordinarily similar to the fights that any political staff member has with his or her boss in the United States, in Washington. And I want to just mention one other place, and that's in a province called Jiangsu. Jiangsu is a quite large industrial province west of Shanghai. And if you take the train, the bullet train from Shanghai to Jiangsu, it's to me one of the most extraordinary sights of China. Essentially for 30, 45, 50 minutes, depending on where in Jiangsu you're getting off, all you see is a line of development. And it occurred to me one day that just as we see subdivisions of 4-bedroom houses in the United States, what you see in China, and I kid you not, I've counted this, you see clumps of 20-story buildings. I don't know the significance of the number, but it's quite profound. And you see it for miles and miles and miles. Now, many of them are empty, apparently. Some of them are filled, and that gets to a broader economic question that we can talk about if you want at the end. But the point is that China's growth is extraordinary, and you don't have to be in China very long as an American to realize that if China does something or doesn't do something, that is essentially what matters in the world today. So that's sort of the premise of this whole talk. In any event, you continue on that bullet train into the province of Jiangsu, and it turns out that Jiangsu is a place that's making arguably more solar panels than any other place in the world. And we'll talk about this story a little bit more in detail. But it turns out that solar energy in Jiangsu has, over the past 5 or 10 years, become one of the main employers. And that has pretty profound political and economic ramifications in China. And I'm going to argue over the next bit of time that that has pretty profound environmental implications for the rest of the world. So keep those in mind. And I want to move just beyond the anecdotes to some statistics quickly. China, as I mentioned, is building a massive number of new coal-fired power plants. You've probably heard these statistics. Here's what I want to highlight. There's an organization in Paris called the International Energy Agency, and it's essentially the repository of conventional wisdom on things energy. And the IEA, which is the acronym, says that China's coal-fired power fleet, that is China's group of coal-fired power plants, is the most efficient in the world. Interesting, no? Why? Because remember I talked about those government planners in Beijing? One result of the work of those government planners is that while China is building lots of coal-fired power plants, it's engaged in a strategy to build a different kind of coal-fired power plant. So it is systematically tearing down old, small, inefficient power plants, and it is replacing them with large, significantly more efficient power plants. To be even more specific, it's closing down power plants on the East Coast, which is the populous part of China, Shanghai, Beijing, and the area around the two. It's essentially decreed that power plants cannot operate in those areas, and it is building very large power plants in China's Midwest, as it were. And then it's building massive power lines to take that power from these new, more efficient power plants back east to the power centers. And I'll tell you, I have to stop telling you anecdotes or I'm going to burn through all my time, but one of the most striking visits I made in China was to an experimental research station from a company called State Grid. Has anyone heard of State Grid? So this is really interesting. 2 people in the room have heard of State Grid. State Grid is the largest utility in the world. The largest utility in the United States is a fraction of the company that State Grid is, and State Grid has established an office in Silicon Valley. State Grid is interested in international deals, and on the day that I visited, I looked at this massive R&D facility where State Grid is building these huge towers to truck electricity from these new coal-fired power plants to the east. And essentially, State Grid is the only company in the world that's doing this kind of stuff because China is the only country in the world that's building this kind of stuff. Brazil is as well, but actually China is starting to export its wares to Brazil for that business. So that's coal. Last November, another statistic, last November China pledged 2 things. You may have read about this. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, and Barack Obama, our president, met in Beijing for something called the APEC Summit. And they came out with an announcement, and in the announcement about climate change, China pledged that by 2030, 25 years from now, China's carbon emissions would peak and then start to fall. Now, you have to understand that China's emissions, and we'll look at these slides in a moment, China's carbon emissions have been rising a lot, so that was seen as quite an announcement. China also announced that by 2030 also, what China refers to as non-fossil sources of energy. So that's an important term. That's not just beautiful things like solar and wind turbines, that's also nuclear energy, which depending on where you sit is just as beautiful or not just as beautiful. But those things together will collectively account for about 20% of China's energy consumption by 2030. And China also said that over the next 15 years, China will deploy as much of that non-fossil energy as the US, as much of that non-fossil electricity capacity as the US has, period. So it gives you a sense of the extent of the construction in China and the stakes in China if you care about these issues. Last bit, China over the past 10 years has become the world's largest producer and the world's largest deployer of solar panels and wind turbines. So again, as we'll get to in a few minutes, that's a great thing or a horrible thing depending on what you want solar and wind power to do. Okay, why is China doing this? I'm going to suggest to you that it's not doing this largely for reasons of climate change. I think China's doing it largely for 4 reasons. One is air pollution. One is jobs. China has begun to see that these industries can be significant employers, even though they are small in the context of the Chinese economy today. In certain industrially significant and therefore politically significant provinces, they're extraordinarily important as job supplies. Third reason is technological development. If you read the 5-year plan, and I encourage you to, if you're interested enough to be here today, you can just Google it and you can find English translations and summaries. But if you look at, everyone know what the 5-year plan in China is essentially the government's plan for economic development, which is, as the name suggests, promulgated every 5 years. And if you look at the succession of the last few 5-year plans and the portion on energy, it's fascinating. China, as you may know, has a fairly strong central government. And so it's worth thinking about what the government's saying about its priorities. And if you look at the question of clean energy over the last 2 or 3 5-year plans, you see that the area of clean energy has been identified as a strategic industry, and that the goals of that strategic industry have been articulated increasingly specifically with increasing nuance over the years. That says something about China's direction. So, technological development. China has also articulated more broadly that it wants to move from being a cheap manufacturing economy to a value-added innovation economy. And this fits right in with that. Now, it's wonderful to say that. It's a little messier to do that, and we're going to get into that messiness when we talk about solar energy. But that, as a broad point, is a priority of China's. And the last bit, which may seem a little strange to you, but I think is actually pretty important in China, is bragging rights. It turns out that China is increasingly cognizant of its position on the world stage. And that world stage includes discussions about climate change, as climate change becomes a kind of more front and center issue. And China does not like being made to seem like the bad boy internationally. And so to the extent that China can articulate clean energy goals that China believes are consistent with other economic priorities in China, China is doing that. One other issue of bragging rights, which is that it turns out that some of the brands, the Chinese corporate brands that have become most notable internationally, are renewable energy brands. So think about Chinese products. Most of you are typing on Chinese products. Most of you are calling someone on Chinese products. Arguably, you're wearing them. And I suspect that if you look at the tags or the labels on those products, they're not Chinese tags or labels. They're manufactured in China, but they're branded American or European. Not so with a lot of clean energy technology, particularly as we'll talk about solar panels. The most well-known solar companies in the world are Chinese brands, and they've succeeded in branding themselves even in the United States. That's quite a leap for China and something that's really, really important in the kind of psyche of the country. Okay, so enough of a wind-up. I cannot stand PowerPoint presentations, but I nevertheless want to show you a few slides. I'm going to do them very quickly, but I want to kind of give you a sense of what's going on in the country. I'm going to do them quickly. I'm happy to go back to them at the end, but I'd rather sort of hold questions till the end. You'll get the kind of story as we go along. So here we go. All right. Crisis. Why is China doing what it's doing? That's Shanghai. That was a picture I took out of my hotel room in Shanghai a couple of years ago. Now, a bit of that is the reflection from the glass, but most of that is not the reflection of the glass. Most of that is what I breathed when I walked out the front door of the hotel. That's sort of all you need to know about a reason that China is doing what it's doing. That's walking down a street in Beijing. I talked to you about the masks. So I'm not suggesting that the man on the right who's smoking a cigarette is contributing markedly to pollution in China, but the woman on the left who's wearing a mask is part of a large group of people who's doing that. It's fairly striking if you've not been there or if you've been there only 1 or 2 times to see people walking down the street like that. And that's me, and I'm not dressing up for the camera. That's the fancy face mask that I was given on my trip in November. And you can see sort of to the right, on the right side of the face mask, there's a little black thing. It didn't come out great in my iPhone picture, but that's a filter. So this is a very fancy face mask. This is the kind of stuff that has a charcoal filter in it to filter things. Anyway, okay, so that's why. How important is what China is doing? Now, bear with me. I think this is kind of important. I guess I have a microphone so I can move. Okay, so I'm not going to get into the specific words here, but I just want to give you a sense of relative importance. If the world is to reduce emissions of carbon emissions to the extent that a lot of scientists say is necessary, and that is reducing reducing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide That is the blanket of carbon dioxide over the planet, ensuring that that doesn't get thick enough, dense enough, to heat the planet up more than 2 degrees Celsius beyond industrial levels, if we're going to stay below that threshold. This is what the International Energy Agency tells us needs to happen to emissions from energy, carbon emissions from energy over the next 25 years. So all I want you to understand is that is a heck of a reduction in emissions. If the world, first of all, did that, you would feel it. You would all feel it. You would be driving something different. You would be living in a different kind of a place. You might be spending your week at Aspen differently. You might be wearing different things. You probably would be eating different things. So I want you to understand that this is not just sort of an academic proposition. But for the point of this discussion, what I really want you to see is the red bit. Who has to do the heavy lifting if the world is going to reach this threshold? So look at the United States, which we tend to think is the most important place in the world. And look at China. And I don't really have to explain the rest to you, do I? And I would just argue to you that this is the stuff of argument at international negotiations over climate change. Who does what? And the reason is this. Not to put too fine a point on it, if you accept the notion that climate change to a large extent is human-induced, and that that's a result of emissions of carbon dioxide over many, many years, it's pretty clear that the Western world, the United States and Europe, have emitted most of the stuff. And now we've gotten to a point where we're industrialized. We've gone through the greatest part of our growth, and the world is now thinking about imposing restrictions. And China, which is only now in the middle of its growth, arguably sort of at the tail end of the huge bit of its growth, is being confronted with the ultimatum to reduce its emissions. And that is why the red bit is so big and the green bit is so small. I think that's extraordinarily important to keep in mind in understanding all of this. Okay, let me move faster. Thirst. Why? What are China's consumption habits? Okay, so this is expected growth in energy demand over the next, you can see the blue is over the next essentially 10 years and the yellow is over the 15 years beyond that. So what, not to put too fine a point on it, look at the size of the blue bar. Look how much China's energy demand is expected to grow over effectively the next 10 years. And the US isn't even broken out on the list because it would be so insignificant. We are part of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Collectively, the OECD, which is essentially the US, Canada, Europe, Western Europe, amounts to a fraction of the growth in China. Okay? Sorry. This is basically the same chart. You can see the expected growth in demand in certain places. What I really want you to look at here is the little bar, the pie chart in the lower left. So this is the share of expected growth in energy demand over the next 25 years in the world. Just look at the red. That's basically China and India, and to a smaller extent, other Southeast Asian countries. That's where the game is going to be won or lost. Okay. Now we're going to get a little bit more specific, and then we're going to finish the slides. So this is all just indicative of the trend I've just outlined. So this is electricity demand. Again, this is the yellow is basically today, and the blue is the delta, what's expected to happen between today and 2040. Again, look at China. Can you even see the US on there? No. You see, look at how China compares to OECD Americas, which is the United States and other parts of North America. Okay. We can come back to these if you want to ask questions. Now, these next two are the US and China. So this is electricity in the United States. I'm going to go forward and toggle back. Just kind of keep this picture in your mind. What I want you to see are a couple of things. What's happening to coal? It's declining. It's expected to decline. Natural gas expected to increase. Renewables expected to increase, the green. Nuclear expected to stay basically flat. And look at the kind of gray line that's superimposed over this, and this is the emissions intensity. That means basically how much carbon dioxide is released for every bit of electricity that's produced. And what do you see? You see a fairly significant decline over the past 5 or 10 years, and you see an even more significant decline projected over the next 30 years or so. Why the decline thus far? Just shout it out. Renewables, what else? Gas, exactly. Gas even more than renewables. We have shifted in our electricity production to a large extent away from coal and toward natural gas. Natural gas emits about half as much carbon dioxide for every bit of electricity it produces as coal does. And that shift has huge carbon implications. In addition, we're getting more energy efficient. We are getting more energy out of every bit of whatever we burn. Okay, that is today that's the United States, and look at China. So let's go back to the US, and that's China. So is China brown or green? Yes is the answer, right? You tell me. So look at China's anticipated growth in coal consumption. So a couple of interesting things. The rate of growth in coal consumption is expected to level off. It's not going to be as significant going forward as it has been over the last 10 years, but it's still going to be a massive amount of coal burned. Gas is still, and this is debatable, but gas is still not expected, at least by the IEA, to be a huge contributor to electricity in China. Look at renewables. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I'm going to suggest to you that whether or not that has a huge environmental impact, that is a massive economic story. Even if that's a small part of the total energy pie globally, there are a lot of people who are going to make a lot of money on that green slice, and there are a lot of people who are going to lose their shirts. And that has begun to play out already, and we're going to get into that in a moment. Okay, I better go more quickly. So let's talk about sort of the green part of what's happening in China. So this is growth expected in electricity generation from renewables in China, or in the world. That is, where is renewables electricity generation expected to grow the most? So same story, right? Look at the US and look at China. We hear about this green revolution in the United States. Look at how the US bar compares to the China bar. Okay. And then they break it out there in terms of what's happening in China. A lot in wind, a sizable percentage in solar. And if you were to compare what the situation is today to the projection that this represents, you'd see solar's growth just really rocketing up. The change is quite profound. Again, this is a projection. Okay, I think this is the last slide, and that is solar. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about solar. But again, look at the projected capacity of solar in 25 years. That is to say, if you're interested in the solar industry, where's the action globally? You see what the slide says. Okay, China. Now, I want to point one thing out about this, and forgive me the jargon, but I told you I can't stand sort of ideological platitudes. And this is a confusion that people make, and it drives me nuts because it's actually pretty important. You see the word capacity? Capacity does not mean how much electricity is produced. Capacity means there are enough solar panels which, if conditions were fabulous, if the sun were shining all the time, these solar panels would crank out this amount of electricity. But what do we know? The sun, it turns out, does not shine all the time, right? Nighttime happens. And there are clouds, and there's rain, and the sun is worse in some places. The sunlight is worse in some places than it is in others. So this is a very optimistic projection. This is what could happen in the best of all possible worlds. Anyway, we can have more of a discussion of that later. All right, and this is just a picture I took a couple of weeks ago on a trip to China. This is a solar panel factory, I believe it was in Jiangsu. I will just say one thing about this that we'll get into in a couple of minutes, and that is most of these machines 5 years ago would have been made in the United States and Europe. Now, most of these machines are made in China, which tells you something about an economic transformation happening in China. So those things you see on the cart there, those are stacks. They look like I think most of you are old enough to remember compact discs. My kids over here are not. But a solar cell looks sort of like a compact disc. Those are racks of compact discs. And those things are going to be boxed. Some of them are going to be boxed. Some of them are going to be made into solar panels. And they're shipped all around the world. China is the largest exporter of solar panels in the world. Okay, I think that's it. You know what, let's not get, yeah. So we can go back to this. The other one's really busy, but this is sort of striking to me. I was standing on the roof of a building in China, and this was a fairly large solar installation on the top, believe it or not, of a glass factory. Glass is a hugely energy consumptive industry, as you may know. There's a lot of heating that goes on in building glass. And because of certain incentive systems in China, this glass factory has put in a bunch of solar. The glass factory actually builds a lot of glass for solar panels. And what do you see in the background? Yeah, you see a power plant. So I think that's a fairly true representation of China, and you can tell me whether that's brown or green. Okay, So let me turn off the slides, and let me just take maybe no more than 5 minutes, I hope, and then we'll have some questions. So maybe closer to 10. So I want to talk about solar energy, which I flecked out a little bit, not because I'm going to argue to you that solar is going to take over the world. I'm not going to argue that. Not because I'm going to tell you, although some of you in this room may wish it or may believe it, and maybe you're right, that solar will overtake fossil fuels at some point. There are pretty rosy projections out there. But I just want you to sort of understand the intricacies of what's happening here in China, because I think what's happening and what's not happening and the implications of that globally are really important to understand in terms of understanding the clean energy industry broadly. So let's go back. Well, let me just say at the outset, solar provides how much of the world's electricity? Anyone know?
1%.
You're very smart. 1%. Often people will say 13%. No, 1%. Now, that 1% represents massive growth from the last 5 years. It was an infinitesimal slice, and there are predictions that it may grow larger, but I want you to understand that what we're talking about for the next 5 minutes or so is a tiny slice of the pie, okay? I want to walk you back about 10 years to the start of the solar industry. And what was happening was that the solar industry existed basically only in Germany. Now I'm oversimplifying a bit, but Germany, a place whose sunlight is about as good as New Jersey's, had rolled out extraordinarily juicy incentives for solar, largely on environmental grounds. And so Germany very quickly became the world's largest producer of solar panels and the world's largest market of solar panels. And lo and behold, there were some very industrious Chinese entrepreneurs who had gone to school, scientists who had gone to school, a couple of them interestingly in Australia, at a university that is very advanced in terms of its solar training. And they looked kind of across the ocean at Germany, and they saw the kind of incentives that the German government was dangling, and they saw massive returns that investors were making. Wall Street at the time was hugely enthralled by the solar industry in Europe because the returns were incredibly juicy. And so these guys who had gotten out of school in China came back to their provinces in China, and they realized that actually the production of solar panels is not that difficult. Even though we all think of solar as very high tech, the process that produces solar panels is actually quite simple. You basically buy machines, you set up a line, you hire some people, you train them, you turn on the switch, and out the end comes solar panels. Now, again, I'm oversimplifying, but that's basically it. It's not brain surgery. And so they kind of realized that China can make lots of things cheaply: t-shirts, flat screen TVs, shoes. Why can't China make solar panels cheaply? And so they went to their government, both the central government and their provincial governments, and they got fairly large incentives to set up factories. And they set up these factories and they started cranking out these solar panels, and they shipped these solar panels over to Europe. Most of them were going to Europe. And they were making a lot of money. Their stocks went through the roof. These companies IPO'd in around 2006, 2007. They were huge. They were IPO'd, many of them on the New York Stock Exchange, hugely successful IPOs. And China has a long history of sort of bubble growth of industries where things do well and then people pile on. And that's exactly what happened in solar. And it wasn't long before there was a massive, massive overcapacity of solar production in China. And then what happened? Then 2008 happened. What happened in 2008? The global financial crisis happened. And what happened in Europe as a result of the global financial crisis? All those juicy subsidies sort of went away. And suddenly, there was massive overcapacity from Chinese producers, and there was a massive reduction in global demand, and the bubble was about to burst. So a couple of things happened. There were very, very bloody results on the stock exchange. Shares came crashing down. Companies began to go out of business. And again, as I said at the outset, these industries had become quite important employers in certain provinces in China. And so the central government and the provincial governments, which previously had been subsidizing the manufacture of solar panels, the construction of factories, these are very smart people. And they can read economic numbers. And they decided that they had to shift strategy. That they could, these companies, many of them had become too big to fail, you remember that term, and that they couldn't continue to create more factories because that was sort of a fool's errand. So they shifted their incentives from manufacturing to what's called deployment. They shifted the incentives from making the solar panels to papering the ground with solar panels. It's really interesting, I think, to notice that, that throughout the early 2000s, when China was cranking out all these solar panels, it was installing virtually none of them in China. It was almost exclusively an export industry. which tells you something about what the priorities in China were. Not good or bad, just what they were. So, but then when the economic crisis happened, China switched strategy and they began rolling out incentives actually to paper the landscape in China with solar panels. And lo and behold, over the last 5 years, China has gone from essentially no solar power to being head and shoulders the largest deployer of solar panels in the world. When China does something big. Now, here are a couple of numbers. Last year, there were 39 gigawatts of solar panels installed in the world. Now, gigawatts is a scary big word. I'm not going to try to define it here, but it's a measure of the capacity to produce electricity. Of that 39 gigawatts, that was 22% of all of the solar capacity installed on the planet since the beginning of time. 22% of solar capacity installed ever was installed last year. That says something about the rate of growth, yeah? The biggest chunk of that 39 gigawatts, 10 of them, effectively a quarter, were installed where? In China. By far the biggest chunk of anywhere in the world. The amount that China installed last year was about twice what the United States installed. And you remember Germany, which was the biggest solar power about 10 years ago? The amount that China installed last year was 5 times what Germany installed last year. Now, China also makes more than 60% of the solar panels sold in the world. So, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? That is a good thing if your priority is cheap solar energy, because it means it's one of the chief reasons that you, dear homeowner, can go out now and buy solar panels for about, 20% of what you could have bought them 5 years ago. But if your goal is domestic manufacturing jobs, green jobs, as the politicians like to say, in the American heartland, then what I've described to you is a very bad thing. It means that there's a great sucking sound from the West, and that whole industry has moved to China. And in fact, China is no longer the world's cheapest place to manufacture because of rising labor rates in China. And it turns out that, largely for that reason, and it turns out that China now is losing many of these factories to cheaper parts, particularly of Southeast Asia. So I mentioned that this is an economic story, and I am fascinated by the extent to which solar power, of all things, has become a geopolitical and geoeconomic football. I'm going to stop in a second, but I want to just, for those of you who aren't aware of it, is anyone aware of the trade fight that's going on right now over solar panels? Yeah, so some of you are. So here's a 30-second explanation. SKYLINE. Let me give you a 40-second explanation. So you may have heard of a company called Solyndra. In 2011, there was a company in California called Solyndra that was one of a number of companies that had come up with an extraordinarily technologically sophisticated way to increase the efficiency of solar panels. And Solyndra got a lot of money from the federal government, and Solyndra was celebrated by Silicon Valley, and then Solyndra went bankrupt. What happened? Well, a number of things happened. There are lots of people who say that Solyndra's technology wasn't so great, but something else happened, and this happened not just to Solyndra, but to a whole panoply of companies in the United States and Germany and the rest of Europe that were betting that the key to success in the solar industry was moonshot technological advancement. China happened to them. And what happened in China? It was not moonshot technological advancement. It was slow, slogging, steady efficiency gains on the factory floor. When you produce more widgets than anyone else, you get good at producing those widgets. It was slow, steady gains in factory labs, many of them, in incrementally improving the efficiency of basically commoditized solar panels. And suddenly, what happened to companies in the United States and Europe was that the bar that they had been shooting for dropped. It got harder, it rose. It got harder to meet. And that was because China was producing solar panels for much less money than these companies had in their pro formas. Now, why the tariff fight? And then I'm going to stop in a minute. The tariff fight happened because there was carnage in the United States and Europe as a result of the papering of the landscape with Chinese solar panels. And there's a company called SolarWorld. Has anyone heard of SolarWorld? SolarWorld is a company that was created in Germany, but has what the lawyers call nexus in the United States because there's a factory in Oregon. And SolarWorld went to federal trade officials in the United States and it lodged an international trade complaint. And it alleged two things. It alleged that China the Chinese government was violating WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules, by unfairly subsidizing the Chinese solar industry in contravention of international law. And it argued also that, forget what the government in China was doing, that the companies themselves were selling solar panels essentially at a loss in order to grab share, in order to grab market share. And as a result of both of those things, the allegation went, they were driving companies in the West out of business, and this was not fair play, this was unfair play. So we can talk more about this in questions if you really want to kind of get into the weeds on it, but the bottom line is that this has continued to wend its way through international trade adjudication authorities. American trade officials have found that these allegations have merit. As a result of that, they've slapped tariffs on Chinese solar panels that are imported into the United States. And as a result of that, the amount of money that you pay for a solar panel, if you've bought a solar panel that's imported from China, is more. You're paying more for solar power than you otherwise would have paid. Now, is that smart policy or is that not smart policy? I'm not going to tell you, you tell me. But that's policy that is motivated by a specific view of what the goal of the clean energy industry is and China's place in it. And there's a whole sort of separate saga about what happened in Europe. There's a trade fight between European solar producers and Chinese ones as well. So look, I'm going to stop here. I didn't get to talk about innovation. If you're interested, maybe we can address it in the questions and answer period. All I want to say very quickly is that I think there's an assumption in the West that China doesn't innovate. All China does is take Western technology and manufacture it cheaply. I think that's wrong. I can tell you from seeing what I've seen on the factory floors of China and in research labs in China, largely as part of work that colleagues and I are doing at Stanford, that there is significant innovation that's happening on the factory floor in terms of taking machines and making them more efficient. And also there's significant innovation, perhaps even more strikingly, that's going on in laboratories, research laboratories in China. There are actually some world records that Chinese scientists have come up with that are beginning to scare the pants off of American solar officials. So if you are sort of happy in the notion that the US is on top in terms of innovation, I would just suggest that it might be worth doing some more reading. Okay, so back to where we started. Is China brown or green? China's both. And will China's clean energy bid be significant enough to meaningfully affect climate change? We don't know. But again, if you care about these issues, I just suggest that you pay attention to what China's doing. If you're a betting person, you might pay attention to what China's doing, if you like to play the stock market. I still think, even though lots of other places in the world are increasingly important, India and other Southeast Asian countries among them in these environmental issues, that what China does or does not do over the next 15 years in these areas is essentially going to decide what the world does or does not do. So thanks very much. So we've got, I think, 10 minutes for questions. I'll tell you, here's what I want to do. What I'd rather do is, well, yeah, that's fine. Well, I was going to suggest, why don't we just go around, throw out your questions. It may be that we have a couple of people asking similar questions, and I think it may be more efficient that way. So, Kenny, go ahead.
Ken Field, question number one. You spent a lot of time on electricity, wonderful presentation. My understanding, and I've heard when I'm in China, is that electricity production, coal and solar is a #1 issue, but the second issue, huge there, is transportation.
Right.
And when you're in China and you're on any of the roads, and of course they have highways the same as we do here, absolutely packed with cars.
Yep.
Last year the United States produced 16 million cars. China produced 21 million cars. Okay, so that's another huge issue.
So what's China doing about
Can you spin that just for a moment?
Absolutely. Let's get the other questions and then we'll kind of see how we address them. Thank you.
Hi. Victoria Smith. Did you mean to say that that China would not have been so big in the production of solar panels without the 2008 recession, and they're rescuing those businesses?
Okay. Okay, thank you. Let's just keep going. Sir,
my question is whether or not the quality is good, because a lot of products from China really are not.
Okay.
And there's repercussions.
Right, they're cheap, but are they going to break?
Hi, John Dibbs.
Sorry, I don't see where you are. Oh, thank you.
From Stanford. Okay, anyways, I understand the goal is 18 gigawatts this year in China from 10. but I understand the feed in tariffs and so on aren't working. Did you get any insight as to whether they're going to hit 18 this year? Thank you.
Okay, there are a lot of terms in there that I'll define. Yeah, good. Couple more? Right there.
How do you assess the U.S. government's current policies on improving renewable energy and making sure it's supported?
Okay, great. Couple more? Oh, sorry.
What do you think the United States should be doing, and is our political process in keeping us from doing something?
Okay, good question. Let me take one more and we'll stop, and then we'll take two more and then I'll stop. And then so someone was right here. Please.
Where's the innovation going to come from to improve the flexibility and efficiency of the grid?
Of the grid, okay. Last question, and then we'll stop, and then I'll try to answer quickly, and then we'll have some time maybe for more.
On the economic front, you talked about the...
I don't know where I'm looking, I'm sorry. Oh, thank you, okay.
Hi,
Lights are bright.
Nancy Pels-Paget with the Aspen Institute.
Hi.
You talked about some of the economic implications, but I'm curious about the dilemma of the shutdown of old energy sources, and you mentioned the use of coal in homes. Where do you see this adjustment happening as one industry grows that's more green, but you still have all the old stuff, and there are very costly shutdown issues?
Okay,
So
and
I'm
you're
just
asking
curious.
specifically about China?
Well, anywhere,
More broadly.
but broadly.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let me stop it there. I'm really going to try to do this quickly, and then I think we'll have another round of questions. Can you hold it just 1 second? Okay. So let me just give me 1 second. Let me just try to group these things. Sorry. Give me 30 seconds here. Okay. So good. All right. Let's start with Kenny's question about transport. So it's a very good point. I didn't talk about transport at all, and there are a lot of cars and trucks and planes and trains in China. I remember on one of my early China trips, I was, those of you who know Beijing, there's a main street called Jianguomen Dajie, which is a main east-west thoroughfare in China. And I remember rushing from meeting to meeting, and I was in a cab, and it was just, I figured it was like, I don't know, mid-morning or mid-afternoon. This was not rush hour, and it was an absolute parking lot. And I got out of the taxi, and this is like nothing you've seen in New York or LA. And I got out of the taxi and sprinted to the subway station, which is an amazing subway system in Beijing, and got there. Okay, but it's very difficult to understand the extent of gridlock in China unless you've seen it. So what is China doing? China's doing a lot. China has fairly aggressive policies on fuel economy of cars. China has aggressive policies on electrification of cars. It turns out that there are companies in China selling electric cars for $8,000, tens of thousands of these things they expect to sell, made in China. What does a Tesla sell for? 90. Yeah, so $8,000 versus $90,000. Now, I'm not suggesting the technology is the same, but there is an important point that you should not leave here without, which is that for a Tesla is not going to make much of an environmental difference unless the technology under the hood of a Tesla can be made much less expensively at a sort of China or India price. So that's kind of a big game going on in China. So look, the point is China is trying to massively improve the efficiency of its auto fleet. China is building high-speed rail at a huge rate. I mean, I remember on one of my early trips, I actually pulled out my camera and took a picture when I was on the bullet train from Beijing to Shanghai, which, by the way, is an arguably more convenient way to go than by flying, of the little readout above the door, and the little readout above the door said something like, let's see, was it 180 kilometers an hour? Is that right? About 60 miles, yeah? 100 miles an hour, yeah. I mean, it sort of makes you wonder why it's being done there and not here. But the reason that it's being done there is that China is to a larger extent a cleaner slate than the United States is in terms of its industrial capacity. So the point is, a lot's happening. It's not clear whether China is going to meet these goals, but it's absolutely cognizant of the importance of it. Okay. Okay, let's talk about a couple of questions on solar, and that is, are these panels any good? And then about the sort of intricacy of the Chinese plan to increase solar. So are these panels any good? There are anecdotes to support both sides. There are anecdotes that suggest that so let's remember the solar industry is a very, very young industry. Solar panels are typically sold with guarantees of 20 or 25 years. The thing is that most solar solar panel companies haven't been around for 20 or 25 years. And no one would have expected 10 years ago that as many of them would have gone belly up as did go belly up. So the value of that warranty is somewhat questionable. But you talk to people at solar companies in China and they will admit that their early stuff was not great. They will tell you, and you don't have to have them tell you, you can read the reports that they filed with the SEC, because many of them are US traded, that they took large economic hits because they cranked out solar panels so quickly that they weren't great and they had to go out and actually replace them in the field. That's not something a company wants to have to do. But they've been working on it, and they contend that their solar panels are getting better. And if you look at third-party assessments of Chinese solar panels versus Western solar panels, you find that at least in the sort of middle range, the commodity range, they're fairly comparable. To be sure, there are kind of gold-plated solar panels, I mean that figuratively, that are American solar panels that fetch a higher price, that probably are higher quality, at least the tests suggest. But in the main, they're getting increasingly comparable. Now, there was a question about China's increase of solar power capacity and is it going to make it? So there were a bunch of words thrown around. So China installed what was 10 gigawatts worth of solar power, which was last year, solar capacity last year, which was something like 50%, 40% less than it had said that it wanted to install. And China has said that it wants nearly to double that on an annual rate going forward. Is China going to do that? I don't know. It's a hugely ambitious goal. And I think China's learned some lessons in terms of mistakes that it's made. China has done some dumb things in terms of policy, as the United States has done some dumb things in terms of policy that I will not bore you with here, but if you're interested, we can talk about afterward. I think China's learned from those lessons. China does not like to miss targets. It does not like to get egg on its face by missing targets. So I think that, China, all the suggestions are that China's going to push hard. There was a mention of something called a feed-in tariff. So a feed-in tariff is the kind of subsidy that China has promulgated for the installation of solar panels. And I'll just tell you one little snippet from my last trip, which was that it turns out that this is the subsidy without which people would not make nearly as much money doing solar plants as they make. And there is real concern in China that the bureaucracy is so bureaucratic that the money that's being promised by the government to developers of solar panels, that is, the check from the subsidy, is not coming as quickly as companies are depending on in terms of their financials. And there's a real concern that that may slow the rate of growth. But again, you talk to people in Beijing and this is something that they're aware of. Okay. So there was a question about US policy and then a question about innovation. So let me do US policy last. There's a question about the economic dislocation that comes from a shift from, say, coal to renewables. There is absolutely an economic dislocation, and I don't know whom to believe in terms of whether you get more renewable energy jobs as a gain than you lose in coal jobs. I mean, you can find a study to support whatever answer on that question you want. I think what's salient is that the jobs in renewable energy tend to be in different parts of the country, whether that country is the United States or China, than the jobs in coal, for instance. And so it almost doesn't matter on a net basis whether there are more jobs or fewer jobs. What matters is that some people are going to lose and some people are going to win. And if you're a politician, whether you're a Chinese politician or an American politician representing the losers, you have a pretty difficult time supporting any of the stuff we've been talking about for the last hour. So that's why you hear people, and we can talk about the United States for 10 seconds, talking about something like a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So structuring policy in this area in a way that sort of redistributes money that conceivably could help rectify some of the dislocating effects of this. What should the US do? Where will innovation come from? Innovation, I think, will increasingly come from around the world. I think if you think that innovation is coming only from the United States and Europe, you're not looking broadly enough. I think it's still the case that the cutting edge innovation, and if you talk to people in China, they will tell you this, the cutting edge innovation still comes from the United States and Western Europe and Korea and Japan. But we're actually at Stanford in a project that we're working on plotting some of this stuff on graphs, and what you find is that the gap is narrowing. It's quite interesting. So no one can foretell the future, but things absolutely are changing. US policy, I think that as a broad proposition, the US ought to be cognizant that these industries, these clean energy industries, are increasingly global industries. And that means that the US has a certain place in these industries and other countries have their place in these industries. And what is likely to redound to the maximum economic benefit of the United States is not trying to sort of grab it all for the United States, but being strategic about what the US does well and pushing for that. And that's likely, I think, to probably lead to more jobs and more economic gain in the US than sort of a whole hog approach. So I think we are done. Are we done? We have no more time. Thank you all very much. I hope this was interesting, and I'll stick around. Thanks.